Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to our Committee of Council for Wednesday the 17th of February 2021, and welcome to our first meeting of the new year, everybody. Look, the meeting is being recorded and will be on the Council's website. It is also being live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. Health and safety procedures are on the screens, and for those that are not familiar, if there is an emergency, we do evacuate at the nearest fire exit, which is listed, and we assemble next to the clock tower in the Te Marae Ahine, the square. Health and safety wise, this non-smoking building, a defibrillator is located at the front of house on the ground floor, and toilets in the link span as well. Councillors, we've got all the technology working today, which is great, so you know the procedures there. If I could just ask you to, or remind you really, just to state your name and any of the presenters to state their name, because it is being recorded and live streamed. And we will need to read the motion before we put any vote out as well. All right, we'll move to number 1 on our agenda paper, which is apologies. Bring those up. We have a couple. Apology from Councillor Lou Finlay, who's away, and Councillor Zolfa Gabat, who is in Wellington on council business. So I'll look to move those. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. No comments to those. We will vote, please. That is passed, 13 votes for, none against, thank you. Moving to number 2, which is additional items. And we do have one piece of additional item there, supporting information for the consultation document for the LTP plan, a disclosure statement, and the reason the item is late because it has been completed at the time, it wasn't completed at the time of circulation of the agenda, and it must be considered at our meeting today, because of the auditor's wish to review all parts of this during the audit. So I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Any comments to that? There being none, I'll ask you to vote. And again, that's 13 votes for, none against. Moving to number 3, declarations of interest, if there are any, and I haven't received any. None from the floor. We move on. Number 4, again, public comment. We haven't received any, and we will move on. Number 5, which is confirmation of minutes, and that's the minutes of the Committee of Council meeting of the 10th of June, 2020, Part 1. Publicly confirmed as a true and correct record. That's on page 7 of your papers. I'll look to move it, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Are there any matters arising from that? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. It's just around on page 8, clause 14.2. There's some quite extensive commentary in the minutes, particularly around why a motion on library renewals was lost, about some acknowledgements from the committee about ratepayers, etc. And yet again, I find it's a very one-sided documentation of the meeting, with only some views being recorded, not all. So I think it's all or nothing.
Just one moment. Councillor, the advice I'm receiving is that it was the actual order of the meeting, and the motion was lost. So there needs to be some chronological order to the statements that are there.
Well, I just think that there's quite a lot in that commentary that is subjective rather than reporting of what happened in the meeting. So, for instance, there's a whole lot of discussion on the comments by the Chief Financial Officer. Normally, if a memorandum has been presented, we don't have a whole lot of writing in the minutes about comments made by officers. So I just feel that comments such as the committee acknowledged that ratepayers, especially businesses, needed assistance from council via a smaller rate increase than was consulted on. That was the view of one member around the table. There was no motion to acknowledge that comment, and it's pure speculation as to why the vote passed. We don't know that everybody agreed with that. So, and there are a number of those sorts of comments as well.
Yeah, look, I'm aware we're going forward that that sort of issue has been tidied up. This is rather historical. You can simply vote against it if you want to.
Okay.
All right. Are there any other matters arising from the minutes? Okay. There being none, we'll look to move those minutes. So, if you could vote, please. And that's passed 10 votes for and 3 against. Thank you. All right, we're now through to the main part of our business, which is number 6, which is approving the 10-year plan supporting material, including the draft financial and infrastructure strategies, the updating funding and financial policies, but most importantly, the consultation document for audit. So I'll ask officers David Murphy, Steve Patterson to come forward. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr Mayor, Deputy Mayor, councillors. So we have a presentation which we're going to walk you through. Steve and I will be doing the presentation. Just to maintain social distancing, we'll be swapping in and out as we speak. So just a few introductory points before we sort of walk you through the presentation. I guess it's probably pretty obvious, I mean, given the size of the pile of paper, but there's been a significant amount of work from a wide range of council staff over the last last 18 months or so since the 2019 election. We've got a team available in the gallery to assist with questions throughout the course of the morning. I guess I would say it has been all long-term plans are challenging processes, but this one has been particularly challenging with the COVID interruption during the course of last calendar year, and also the scale of nature calls and the Three Waters Review, which the government is undertaking. A combination of those factors has made it particularly challenging. So, what's presented in front of you today is really a journey, as I said, that started after that 2019 election, but you could also take it further back to the 2016 election and the work we did on the new vision and goals after that informed the last 10-year plan. So it's very much a journey, and this is a continuation of that journey that started with that new vision and goals and the aspirations for the city. What's presented today is a representation of a series of workshops held again throughout the course of the calendar year last year. I guess reminding you all today that it is can be described as a draft of a draft. So the final draft comes back to you before it goes out for consultation. So what you're approving today, you can consider as a draft of a draft. I guess some of the material, had some gaps, and we've worked incredibly hard. We received the final direction from Council on the 3rd of February, and the bulk of the information in front of you today has been refined or prepared during, there was a lot of work that happened before that, but a lot of the information that you see today has actually been prepared in that couple of weeks since that last workshop. So it has been a challenging period, and we know there are the odd gap, and there's the odd piece of information that needs to be picked up, but we'll ensure that that's done, and there is obviously still a month or so before it would go out for formal consultation. Right, so if we just jump to that next slide, I'm not sure whether I can drive from here with the way we've got it set up.
We'll be driving it from behind you there.
So we've probably touched on this. The purpose of the report today is to approve the draft consultation document to go to audit. This allows audit to review the information and prepare a report. So we cannot proceed to the next stage of formal consultation on a draft without approval from audit. As I said in the sort of introductory comments, there has been, the odd gap in the material that was presented on the original agenda. There's been some late items circulated which have largely filled those gaps, but we appreciate there are still some images and financial information and graphs, etc., to be prepared. It will be a work in progress over the next month. It's likely that there will be changes to the material resulting from the audit process. In previous LTPs, particularly the consultation document, what it's looked like, before it went to audit and after, has been quite different. So we anticipate that it will be. Obviously, we can't make any significant changes to the overall plan after today once it goes to audit, because they need a clean draft of a draft to audit. But we can certainly make some adjustments to the CD and supporting material as we go. Next slide, please, Hannah. So we have been engaging with Audit New Zealand, and they have indicated that given the uncertainty around nature calls and the Three Waters reform and the impact that is having on the 10-year plan, it's likely that they will need more time than we'd originally anticipated. So originally we were going to be coming back with a draft on the 3rd of the 3rd of March council meeting. So that's likely to be pushed back to later in March, meaning that consultation will start early to mid-April, and we will have to review the overall project timeframe. That may mean that the consultation period, for instance, needs to be a little bit shorter than what we're anticipating, but we'd like to keep that as long as we can within the overall timeframe that's allocated. It may mean that we need to squeeze the hearings a little bit. It may mean that the staff have shorter time to summarise submissions, but all of those things will need to be worked in so that we can get the plan adopted before the start of the next financial year. So some of the big picture messages in the 10-year plan, as I touched on earlier, we will continue working towards the 2018 vision and goals, and that was confirmed early in this term of council after those last elections. There's four big sort of investment opportunities or challenges, depending on how you describe them, that the LTP will be looking at. So we know about the uncertainty about the timing of the water reforms, so that's quite deliberate language, uncertainty about the timing. So while we're required to assume that all those assets are ours, to a certain degree we are anticipating that the reform will be implemented. And that obviously affects the second bullet point, the nature calls and the significant costs associated with that, and who'll be responsible for delivering that. There's been a big focus this LTP, and I think it's something the council should be proud about in terms of focusing on the renewing and maintaining our infrastructure. It's been a big focus of why the government's looking closely at the Three Waters. We've seen a number of cities across and towns and across the country really start to struggle with some of their assets, and we won't highlight those, but I think there's been some recent examples. So there has been a strong focus through this LTP, and it will continue to be a strong focus going forward with the new asset planning team about making sure that we're looking after what we have. Along with that, we've got substantial growth that is planned or projected for the city that we are planning for, and we need to keep the city growing and continuing to invest in it. So like all LTPs, it's about getting the right balance between achieving our vision, addressing those key issues in an affordable way. So through the workshops and the work we've done in the draft of the draft, we think we've got the balance right in the short term, but we're consulting, do the proposed services and programs deliver on what really matters, and have we got the right emphasis on that infrastructure maintenance in terms of gradually increasing the maintenance budgets over those first 3 years, given the potential risks associated with that. The next bullet point I will read. So under current conditions and LGA rules, Council will be unable to borrow sufficient funds for the Nature Calls project. This means without change, and we know what that change is likely to be, the 10-year plan is not financially sustainable in the medium to long term. And as I touched on, we're in this difficult situation where the government direction has been that we must assume that all the assets are ours, but at the same time we anticipate that there is going to be reform that happens. So obviously that assumption that those assets are ours is really about making sure that we continue to invest in those as if they are ours, which is obviously a good thing to do. But as you said, given the level of likely change to come in the water reforms and Nature Calls, Council will revisit this issue when it has more certainty, and there is the potential in the next 3 years that we need to do a new LTP or an adjustment to this LTP. I touched on this a little bit in the previous slide, but we are recognising that the risks and costs of past underinvestment in infrastructure, and that's something this Council should be proud about. And there is a much stronger emphasis on renewing and maintaining our existing assets. We're taking a 3-year approach to catch up. This does come with some risks of asset failure in the intervening period. We talked about a variety of ways of managing those risks. We have programs to better understand our asset condition and hence our renewals and maintenance profile. So that's something we're going to continue to be investing in, is better understanding our asset conditions and what that means for future investment. There is a similar picture for IM and our people. Our People and Performance Manager used the analogy that this 10-year plan is sort of like a sticky plaster for this when a bandage may be required. So that is something that we will need to continue to think about and address. So some of our key forecasting assumptions. So we've used the medium Infometrics forecast for city growth. So to give you an indication of broadly what that means, it means we'll be needing to provide 5,000 new homes in Palmerston North over the next 10 years, or 500 per year. That is a significant challenge and will require a lot of attention to be able to deliver that. So while we say medium and the last LTP was the high of the stats, this is the medium of the Infometrics, which is a bespoke piece of work that we've commissioned for the city growth assumptions. So it's actually higher than the stats high growth projections that we used last time. So COVID-19, I guess a little bit challenging in the last few days, but we are assuming that there will be no significant adverse impacts. We've responded as a city really well, and we know there is vaccinations and things like that coming, so we're at this stage the assumption is that there will be no significant impact. As I've touched on a couple of times, at this stage the assumption is that the three waters are Council's responsibility. That has been a challenge for all of us because that means, as I said, we are looking after those assets as if they're ours, but it's likely that they won't be. The other assumption has been that Nature Calls the total cost of that is $350 million plus inflation, and that's based on the latest information we have through the Nature Calls program. So I'm going to leave this key forecasting slides assumption up, and Steve's going to present a couple of items on this and then take you through the next few slides, which are on the forecast, the financial elements of the project.
Good morning, councillors. Just following on from David, relating to the key forecasting assumptions. The opening debt balance we've assumed at the start of the next year will be $164 million. That will be dependent upon the progress with the capital program in the current year, but we'll revisit that assumption before the final plan comes before you in May and June. We've calculated an assumption in relation to the interest rate on debt, and that's based on what our average borrowings are at the moment and what the forecasts are for our hedging regime that we have in place. So we've also made assumptions in the plan that you've worked through some of the workshops regarding revenue, and you're aware particularly that we've made an assumption that the council will receive from the wind farm royalties lease arrangements. We've assumed $500,000 in the first year and $800,000 per annum past that. We'll need to review that as we get nearer to the end of the year, just to double check on progress with the implementation, the development of the wind farm, to see that the $500,000 in particular is a reliable estimate. We've also made assumptions, as you're aware, about significantly increased revenue from items such as parking, and that will need to be addressed in reports coming to you in the next month or so. In terms of the financial strategy itself, as you're aware, the legislation requires us to have a thing called the financial strategy, and there are a number of things that the legislation requires that we cover off in such a strategy document. Broadly, in terms of the form of what's before you as a proposed financial strategy, the sort of guiding principles that the council endorsed for the previous 10-year plan are carried over. The document itself has been reformatted a bit to be in a slightly different order with some appendices compared with last time, to try to move things that I felt were more in the nature of supporting information, if you like, were in the back and as an appendix rather than up the front where the key parts of the strategy are outlined. But the overall guiding principles unchanged. At the moment, the thought was that we wouldn't change the debt limits that are shown in there. There's a requirement that we do have prescribed debt limits of some sort, although, as you're aware, for the reasons that David outlined, those debt limits are exceeded for two of those measures from year 4 onward, principally due to the combination of the things, but particularly the scale of the program and the impact that the Nature Calls program has as a proportion of that. The operating programs for the ERP and some of the digital transformation is, as you're aware from the discussions we had in our workshops, to be funded initially from debt and then repaid over a period of 5 to 7 years, where we've said that would be the life of that sort of investment we expected in the normal course. So they are operating programs, though, both of those things in an accounting sense, but we expect a benefit to last for that period, at least. Council has changed, I guess, its assumption in relation to the Whakaronga subdivision in a sense. In the previous 10-year plan, it was assumed that a sum of $10 million would be the surplus from that, and we'd apply that to debt repayment. Discussions during the workshop, you decided that you'd wish to see that channeled into social housing renewals, and so the document is prepared in a way that actually achieves that. Another requirement of the legislation is that the council has a limit described about what the rates increases might be through the term of the 10-year plan. And we have had a formula-based arrangement for that links a forecast, the local government forecast that's prepared by Burl, with another margin that we decided that should be added to that to represent a number of things, including the increasing levels of service in some areas, the funding that's required for asset renewal, and last time an additional thing that was to do with the increased allocation for accelerated debt repayment. That was what we had previously. During the workshops we discussed with you how we might change that. Those provisions for debt repayment have now been removed, and the structured debt repayment profile retained still though against each program. So if we'd left it like that without change, the graphs that you see in the document would show that in most years of the proposed plan, that limit that we'd set last time would have been exceeded. The reality that you have before you is that if we wish to have some sort of a limit that's meaningful, then there needs to be some change to the way in which that's described, that limit. I've included in the document a proposal which is that we retain the link with the local government index, that we add an allowance for the growth in the rating base, and that's consistent, so those things are consistent with what we had in the past. As I said previously, we had a 2% sum that we added to that. And as I've described in this chamber before, there was nothing magic about the 2% figure, but it was just to represent that the council faced increasing costs for a range of things over time, and so we needed to be aware that that was needing to be coped with. Not that and that they were things that were over and above what you'd expect to see in a forecast that dealt with an inflation factor, that these were things about new standards, new things. So that 2% was to reflect that. My suggestion is that that 2% be raised to 3%. It could even be raised more because if you were prepared to do that, given that the outcome, as shown in the graphs, is that in 4 of the years the rates increase percentage is still higher than what this formula produces. Those 4 years relate particularly though to the period through which the Nature Calls project would be coming to fruition and where we'd be borrowing to make that happen. So for the moment, my suggestion is to you that that formula be those 3 components plus an additional component, which is a new one, which talks about the additional funding for renewals. And one of the key elements of what this financial strategy is talking about this time is an increased investment in funding of renewals. Approximately the equivalent of 5% increase in the total rate take needed to fund, in fact a bit more, 5.3%, to fund that increased average renewals over the period, and some more increases in following years as well, to progressively get up to a figure that's about 50% higher than what we currently spend on renewals. So that assumption then about what's an appropriate measure for the rates increase limit has those 4 components that I'm suggesting to you, and you see the outcome of applying the 10-year plan forecasts against that is that in those 4 years, I think, in the centre of that period, that would be exceeded. If we move now to thinking about the assumptions that we've made in the plan about rates, rates, as you're aware, are a combination of a number of different elements: a uniform charge, some targeted rates for water, wastewater and rubbish and recycling and the like, and charges, rates based on the land value. We also have metered water charges for the larger consumers. That is considered to be a rate as well. So the suggestion is that the UAGC remains at $500. That's what it is for the current year. And that recommendation is partly influenced by the fact that there's a need, in order to fund the water and wastewater activities to the levels that are planned in this budget, those targeted rates need to increase quite significantly, about $50 or slightly more in each case. And the metered water charges, likewise, to maintain relativity with that, need to increase by about 10%. There is assumed in the figures that we'll have a targeted rate for that Palmy bid area in the central area of the city that covers roughly 440 commercially rated properties in the central city within that defined area that was talked about before Christmas when the council endorsed the proposal from the Palmy bid group. So their rates, in terms of that targeted rate, 50% of that would be collected from a fixed charge, and the amount of that's outlined in the documents, and the balance would come from a rate that's based on the capital value of the properties involved. The assumption in the document as well is that there'll be no changes inherently to the differential system or the surcharges that relate one category of property to another. So the increase that's shown in the rates that would be required for the first year, the total rates for the city, is approximately 6.9%, or as much as 7.1% if you add the sum that's to do with the bid, which falls just to those few ratepayers. But coincidentally, that translates to almost exactly the same percentage increase for the single unit residential ratepayers, whose rate would increase from that average for a property of $243,000 land value to that 2,820 per annum. And you'll see on that chart in front of you how that rate would be made up. The components that are the land value component, the components that are the targeted rates, etc. So there it shows the water and wastewater charges of $299 and $307 compared with $241 and $255 in the current year. So that leads to the picture in terms of the rates increase that I talked about. The green line describes the percentage increases in the total rates that the council would be requiring in each year over that 10-year period. With, as I said, 6.9 in the first year, 8.3 in the following year, 8.1, leading up to a peak of just over 11% at the time when there's the biggest part of the investment happening in relation to the three waters, the wastewater program. If we continued with the present limit that was in the past 10-year plan, that's the red line, and you can see that that really doesn't signal anything much to our ratepayers at all, except that in every one of those years, bar one, probably that would be exceeded. So as I described a little bit earlier, the proposed limit that's shown on the chart there is the blue line, which will vary each year, I recognise, in terms of applying it, because percentages are strange things in a sense and can do some perverse stuff. But for the moment, that's the best that I can come up with as a way of trying to describe what a limit might be. And recognise as well that within 3 years we're going to be, well, 3 years max, but maybe even within that we'll be reviewing the whole of the 10-year plan once we know more about the wastewater program option and the timing of the Three Waters changes for the reforms. This graph is the one that we've traditionally used to show the council's debt position. The debt, as it's shown in the documents, would increase from 164 million to 861 million. Obviously a very significant increase to fund the program of works over that period. All those investments that we're looking to make on behalf of the city. But the reality is that the red line prescribes this ratio as the council's, if you like, prudent borrowing ratio. The market through our providers, particularly the local government funding agency, where we source most of the vast majority of our funding these days, have a limit that's the blue line, and we, in year 2, 4, 5, get really close to that line and then exceed it beyond that. So I guess it's this particular graph that's the one that leads to the description of the plan being financially unsustainable over the medium to longer term. The rates increases that are required are high, but they're, I suppose, describable and understandable, I would think, by the community. But the crunch comes if you can't borrow the money in order to achieve it, then that's problematic. So that's why this graph leads us to that statement about the financial sustainability of the plan. And as we all know, the government's proposing changes that hopefully will help us address that as a community. One of the other policies we're required to have is the revenue and financing policy. That's been circulated to you. It's circulated slightly separately from the rest of the order paper there. It's not changed materially from what we had last time, except to try to format it in a way that reflects the new description of the activities. So there's nothing fundamentally different there. It primarily describes the council's policy in terms of the use of the way we would use different tools to fund different types of expenditure, and then describes what we think about how those costs would be spread in the community, and particularly the split between what's a public good, if you like, and paid for through rates in some way, and what's more targeted towards the particular users. In terms of the way in which the budget's been prepared, there are some of those targets which are challenged and perhaps not quite met. And the examples of that are ones which we've traditionally had a little bit of a problem with, that include the cemetery and crematorium, where that has struggled to meet our targets, and so we'll need to be addressing that again as part of the report to you on the fees and charges for that. Things like the conference and function centre is struggling to meet its targets, but that's partly the recovery, the assumptions we've made in the recovery from COVID, where the revenue's not quite yet meeting the expectations that we had previously, because that was getting closer to the target that we have. So suggestion is, for the moment, that we leave that policy unchanged in relation to that as being our target. Another one that I know is a concern of councillors is to do with animal control. That policy is that at least 80% of the cost of animal control would be borne from fees and charges of one sort or another. And at the moment, in terms of the way the budget's prepared, those fees and charges don't achieve that. The figures, if I remember them correctly, it represent about 76% of the cost being borne from fees and charges, which means a bit over 24% is borne from the general rate. And I suspect that's the main reason for that is this investment that's likely to be had in a new animal shelter that's coming up, where that's starting to influence in a greater way a bigger proportion of the cost having to be borne from the general rate in order to fund that. So those are the key things in relation to the revenue and financing policy, and I guess for the moment is the finish of the part of the presentation, and David will take over again from here.
Thank you, Steve. David.
We're just about there. So, infrastructure strategy. So that's been updated to reflect some key issues which have emerged since the last infrastructure strategy. So they're there in front of you on the list. Particular one that's been drawing a lot of attention recently is the contractor availability, and just the with the government's New Zealand upgrade, shovel-ready projects, the growth occurring within the country, that is proving a real challenge. But the overall direction of the infrastructure strategy remains the same, other than those issues that I've talked about. We've updated the development contributions to reflect all the new programs and the projected growth. That has resulted in a doubling of the residential fees. Our residential fees were already at that sort of probably low to medium at a national scale, probably closer to low, I'd say. So, and they are, despite that doubling, they are still, from what we've looked at, competitively priced at a national level. Greenfield development areas will also have additional cost over and above infill development areas or brownfield redevelopment. So that base fee doubles, but where you're doing development in a greenfield, there will be specific additional costs for the likes of stormwater and local reserves. In terms of what's next, so assuming the material is approved today, it goes off to audit, who reviews. As I touched on this earlier, once that comes back, we'll report to council, and then the consultation will go out. While it's with audit, we'll be reviewing the timeframe, and we'll be keeping the council in the loop around those exact dates, and we may need to have some extraordinary meetings and things to get this across the line. So I guess one last thing I would say in terms of anticipating questions this morning, so we've got the team here, we have to keep our social distancing, but we'll I imagine there'll be questions that need to be answered from a breadth of the team. Also, I anticipate there'll be questions or feedback that you'd like to give, and sort of think about that in three ways. One is if you identify things that are sort of minor grammar, presentation type material, then just email those directly to Andrew. The Chair and the Mayor and Deputy Mayor have the authorisation to approve minor amendments. So if you think it's more than grammar and presentation but a minor amendment, then again encourage you to email those through to Andrew, and then before it goes to audit we'll get the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to approve those minor amendments. If it's neither one of those two, it will require an amendment today in terms of a change to a program, a timing of a program, a budget, one of the strategies, something like that. So, and on that theme, In terms of the southern grandstand for the arena, at the moment that is at years 7, 8 and 9 at $14.5 million, uninflated, with 90% external funding. I think it's unlikely to be able to be progressed with a 90% external funding, so officers are comfortable recommending that has changed to 66%. It has been suggested that the plan be amended to bring that project forward to years 3 to 5, with a budget of $12 million, based on some updated information from Bryce and his team, with 66% external funding, and with the design and consent phase in year 3, and then the bulk of the money in years 4 and 5. That timing would allow the council to start the fundraising during the course of this LTP, with the construction sitting in the next. So that change will require a council resolution along with any other changes that are tabled today. So we're happy to answer questions and go from there.
All right, thank you, David and Steve before you. I'll open up for questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thanks, David and Steve. I do have quite a few questions, if that's okay. I'll just start with the questions that have arisen from the presentation. On page 6 of the presentation, it talks about the LGFA rules that it says that council, and in terms of our key messaging, that council will be unable to borrow sufficient funds for the Nature Calls project. I guess given the $1.489 billion capital program that's in the LTP, and Nature Calls being $350 million of that, which is a bit less than a quarter of that, I'm just wondering why we're identifying Nature's Calls as being the program that causes us to break the LGFA rules, rather than any of the other $1.1 billion worth of capital program that's included in the LTP.
Well, I guess it's the most significant, and if you were to remove it, then those rules wouldn't be broken.
Sorry, what was that?
I guess it's the most significant, and my understanding, and Steve may want to comment, is if you were to remove that, then those financial rules would not be broken.
Okay, so if $350 million less expenditure would allow us to meet the LGFA rules, why have we identified Nature Calls as opposed to a cumulative effect of any number of the other, particularly, for example, there's $800 million of capital new programs in the plan that isn't Nature Calls, so why haven't we identified a cumulative effect of any of that spending as the reason for us to be unsustainable or breaking those rules?
Yes, the reality, Mr Mayor, is that it is the total capital program that's unaffordable. There's no question about that. But the biggest single program is this particular one, and because of the uncertainty, I suppose, of the future and the timing of the future delivery of that and whose responsibility it is, that's why we've, I suppose, matched that program and the uncertainty regarding the future management of that activity together as part of this message. It is true to say, though, that it is the total capital program that's the one that's, in the end, not able to be afforded.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the other questions that was quite closely related to that I did have was how much reduction in the capital program would be required for us to have a plan that met the LGFA rules. David's mentioned that if we took $350 million out, that it would, but is anyone able to say how much reduction would be required for us to meet those limits?
I haven't done a recent calculation of that, but we'll do that during the course of the next little while and see if we can give you a figure relating to that.
Thank you. The next page of the presentation, page 7, had a comment about the 3-year catch-up. of the infrastructure underinvestment. And the papers seem to have included a 5.3% increase for renewals in year 1 and a 3% increase in year 2, but nothing in year 3. And certainly my understanding from the workshops had been that I guess what is 8.3%, I had expected that was going to be spread over the 3 years, and the presentation has indicated a 3-year catch-up. So I'm just wanting to understand why all of that is sitting in year 1 and 2 in their budgets.
Mr. Mayor, in answer to that question, the plan that we have, the way our funding of renewals has always been that we've got the rolling 3-year average of the whatever renewal program falls out of the asset management plans and the council's decisions about what's important. So all through the whole process, we've looked at the renewal program and tried to plan that at what's an appropriate time. The discussion in the workshops has been more particularly about increasing the level of the maintenance and the timing of the increased level of maintenance and scheduling that over 3 years. So you'll recall we've had 2 or 3 different goes at the timing of and how we'd go about that. And the way that that's structured at the moment is that increased level of maintenance is looking to be funded a significant lift in this first year, and about that same level retained in the second year, and then another lift again in the third year. So our discussions weren't so much about smoothing the renewals over the 3 years, it was about smoothing the maintenance increase, those gaps.
Okay, thank you. The next page talks about the forecasting assumptions, and one of those being the 350 million plus inflation for nature calls. At a recent workshop late last year, we were told that the most likely options being currently assessed were 300 million or less for the nature calls, and I'm just wondering if anything's changed since then, or if not, why the additional 50 million has been included.
I think this is a planning assumption, really, and we were trying to be a little bit conservative in terms of thinking about what might need to be coped with, and there's been no decisions, as far as I'm aware, about any particular option and what the real costs of that might be in the end. And so this planning assumption is that we hope that any solution could be found within a 350 million plus inflation assumption. That's the basis for the decision. Being conservative, if you like, in terms of the way in which you've described it. We hope we're being conservative.
Okay, so just a further question on that. So if we were to only include 300, for example, million in the long-term plan for nature's calls, and it turned out that we needed more than that, could that be then factored in the next long-term plan, given that most of the costs of that don't kick in until year 4?
Well, I think if we need to think about the whole context of what we're saying about the 10-year plan, what we're saying is that we don't really know yet what the preferred option will be and what it will cost, and that's one of the great uncertainties we have for the 10-year plan. We also don't know whether the council is going to be the entity that's going to be required to deliver that. So the combination of those things means that, from my perspective, that there's really little sense, if you like, in changing our expectations, that basic assumption, that we should just acknowledge that's our assumption, work with it, and then proceed.
Okay, thank you. Just the last page on the presentation is a new item that I hadn't been aware of as being discussed in any workshop, so I'm presuming that idea has come forward very recently. It says it has been suggested that the plan be amended. I'm just wondering where that suggestion has come from. So,
in conversation with the Mayor's office and preparing for today, it was discovered that, the program is at years 7 and 8, so it's been suggested by the Mayor.
Yeah, and with consultation with our steering group as well.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm just moving on.
Just, sorry, Councillor, I might break this up. How many more questions have you got?
Perhaps about 3 more.
Okay, well, if you could get through them as quickly as we could, because there's lots in the queue. Thank you.
Okay, some of the high-level financials are new to us, so I do have a few questions on that. Page 535 of our papers. Sorry, just finding it myself. The prospective statement of comprehensive revenue and expenses show quite high surpluses in year 2, 12 million, and then going up to 21 million, 20 million, and then higher, even 40, 46, 55 million surplus, which is quite a lot higher than I've seen in the past. I'm just wondering what the rationale or reason for budgeting with such high surpluses are, as opposed to charging less rates in those years to the ratepayers.
A lot of those surpluses are the result of the subsidies and the DCs that the council receives through that period. So those surpluses are used, if you like, then to repay the debt. That in the case of DCs, we've funded the things from debt in the first instance, then we get the DCs. So we need to have the surpluses coming in from those capital subsidies in order to make that all happen. So if you look particularly at that line that talks about capital revenue, you'll see that that's where the big sums come in. And unless we have those, we won't. We have to describe them that way in order to cover off what we've borrowed previously to fund growth, particularly.
And so are those surpluses factored into the debt reduction in the following years?
Yes.
As a part of the assumptions?
Yes.
Okay. Just in terms of the discussions we've had in workshops around the programs that have been provided to us to consider, and then what's been described as MSL, or the funding that is required for maintaining service levels. I'm just wondering what the total budget amount for MSL would be for year 1, for example.
I can describe that in a way that's going to meet with what your question. Can you just rephrase it, perhaps?
Okay. I guess where I'm coming from and what I'm really interested in is what the percentage increase is in MSL. So I'm aware that we have the opportunity to consider all the programs that are new or additional to MSL, but in terms of understanding, there's been some assumptions provided in workshops about what the increases to the MSL are. So I do think it gives us context in being able to understand what the level of percentage increase in MSL is in any particular year. And particularly going into year 1 would be useful to know. Yes,
we have some material that I haven't just got available to me on the screen at the moment to be able to give that. We'll just look that up and come back to you in a moment.
Thanks, Steve. Any more questions, Councillor?
I'll pause there if you'd like to go to someone else.
I'd like you to, thanks. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I've just got one question at this stage, David. Just the slide that we've got in front of us here, I've got no issue with what's been proposed. I'm just wondering, the budget of 12 million that's uninflated, I just wondered how accurate is our best guess of those figures at this stage, considering in particular the last 12 months where we've seen quite significant gaps between what we thought a tender would be and then what it comes in with, and just the comment around those figures being uninflated, whether we need to actually put put something, a buffer in there at this stage, or actually we're comfortable with where those are at?
I'll let Bryce deal with the $12 million question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so currently we only have conceptual plans for this, and that price has been determined based on those plans. As we continue to get into a lot more robust, detailed design and actually go out for tender, as you said, there is some risk around that changing. That being said, in those budgets we have built in a bit of a contingency to try and handle that as best we can, but exactly what that figure would be come tender time, I couldn't tell you.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
In terms of inflation, if we enter those figures into the system, there will be inflation automatically added for the years because our system will apply inflation to it. So the underlying figures will be included at that level if that's what you choose to do, and then inflation will be added.
Thank you, Steve. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I think this is probably a question for Steve around the 10% approximately increase in the fixed components for the water costs on rates. Will that result in a disproportionate effect on households with low land value? So will they, since the fixed fees apply equally to everyone, will it mean that there'll be a higher rates increase for those with lower value properties compared to higher? Or have you evened it out across the whole range?
There will be a marginally increased percentage-wise at the lower end than what there is at the higher end, but the differences are not really that material. I mean, we can't, there's sort of not a way of fixing that, to be honest.
Okay. So I've got some questions relating to specific pages on the consultation document. So on page 63, which I'll just get to, there's a discussion of items that were considered but not included for the Connected Communities goal, I suppose. There's a couple of programmes listed, and then it says, I think it says actually just ahead of it, other programmes we considered are on page, and obviously the page number isn't there because we don't know what page it might be yet. But where are those? Because I looked through the supporting document, I couldn't see where those other programmes that were considered but not included are. Presumably they're in the supporting material somewhere?
Yeah, Andrew actually alerted to me this morning that those need to be added to the consultation document. So that is. Yeah.
But are you able to tell me where those other programmes are in the supporting material at the moment, or could you later?
They haven't been included in any material at the moment. Our intention is to add them. We just forgot to explicitly tell you we would be adding them.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Good answer. So on page 114 of the supporting material, which is around the goals, and it's in particular the goal of a connected and safe community, my recollection from the last workshop we had was that there was general agreement for the inclusion of a commitment to being a refugee resettlement city. And I can't actually see that in the strategy. And I think the discussion, if I remember correctly at that time, was that we would include an explicit commitment to that in the strategy. And I wondered if maybe Julie or someone could answer that.
That's certainly my recollection of the conversation. I should check with Julie as to whether we...
So you said it's in the plan but not the strategy. Yeah. I think from my recollection of, because it was me that initiated it, that we agreed to have it in the strategy so that it was at a high level, because lots of people don't look further down into the plans, and so someone that would just took a quick look through our strategy would then see it.
That was certainly my recollection from the conversation at the workshop, so I think we can record that as a minor amendment.
Okay, thank you. And then my next specific question about the consultation document is around social housing on page 226. So it's talking about where are we now, and it talks about our social housing, and there's a bullet point that says the balance of council social housing is provided at subsidised rental rates, and then there's a little note 10, and then note 10 says subsidised rentals will be no more than 30% of superannuation, supported living payment, job seeker and so on. Now, in a previous meeting, we agreed to review that policy because we were unhappy as a council with 30% being seen as a target rather than an up to. And so I just want some clarification about including that in the consultation document. Does that then mean that we won't be able to review that policy as part of the 10-year plan? So in other words, if we approve this with the little note saying it's at 30%, is that then set in stone? Or how is that? Because I did ask a question about when we could have the policy reviewed, and I was told it would be during deliberations on the 10-year plan.
I'll just ask one of the officers to respond.
Through you, Mr Mayor. So the answer is no, that would not be set in stone. This is a proposal just as any other proposal is. So because the councillors asked for that to be reviewed but didn't actually set a particular direction, what these documents propose is that the status quo is there, the 30% threshold, and then what we're proposing to do is through the deliberations process, once submissions have been received, is provide some advice about the options for how that could be changed and the potential consequences of doing that. So the intention is during the consultation process is to highlight that that is in fact the guideline, current guideline, and to ask for submissions about that. So for example, when we talk to the Housing Needs Monitoring Group, we would talk about specifics of that policy and ask for their feedback, for example. So it'd certainly be highlighted in the consultation process.
So would we be bound by the usual rule that if we didn't receive a submission requesting it to be changed, then it would stay at 30%?
That's not a rule that I'm aware of.
Oh, okay. So anyway, to clarify, you feel that we would still be able to propose a different figure during deliberations?
Absolutely. My understanding is that the discussion that councillors had was about some tenants rather than all tenants, and so I guess there are two different things here. One is the absolute threshold, which is the guideline for social housing, and what is affordability and what that's based on, and we can provide some more advice about that. But the other is about how it's implemented, and I think those two separate issues got somewhat muddled during the discussion in committee. So I think when we provide some advice at deliberations time, if councillors want to provide direction, for example, about the threshold being applied differently for different groups of tenants, then absolutely that could be taken through to an operational application.
Thank you. That's helpful. And then I've got a couple of questions just about the usability of the document as a whole. So I'm not sure who those go to. But one question is around, is there any searchability on the electronic document? So if, for instance, if you wanted to look up all suggestions or references to, say, biodiversity or social housing or whatever it might be, is that going to be possible in the document?
Yes, I can answer that one. So the intent is to put all this material on the website, but also to bundle it all into one big PDF for someone who wants to search for all mentions of, in that case, biodiversity.
Oh, great, thank you. And the other comment I would have is that without referencing the previous 10-year plan, you know, without having a copy of it next to you, it is quite difficult to see how spending has been changed in different areas. So is there any thinking to provide some comparison with, say, the previous 10-year plan, maybe for key things in the consultation document, or for, because it's hard to see how spending is being changed unless you're very intimately associated with the process?
No, we're not looking at trying to do that. I think what we've got's what we've got here at the moment, really. I think one of the struggles with comparing back to the last 10-year plan is just the structure of the activities that you're talking about, and trying to draw the line as to what you're comparing, whether you're comparing like with like, and it's just all a bit hard, I think, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. That's it for now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just down to a couple substantive areas of question now, thanks to the good work of Councillor Johnson nailing a few that I had. Questions around the proposed use of the revenue from the Turitea wind farm. I guess there's two things that I'd like to try to establish. The first is just around in the early 2000s, when first council proposed the change of purpose of the reserve, and then went on to propose the development of the wind farm. My understanding at that time was that the broad intent that was signaled to the community was around use of that revenue for biodiversity. Words like eco-park and the Turitea Reserve were thrown around, et cetera. Is that consistent with what actually happened at that time?
Yes.
Thank you. The second area of question there is really around understanding what precedent we have as a council around tagging or ring fencing revenue for specific uses. And it seems to me that there's a number of examples where we do that. We just had earlier today on the slides an indication that we're using the Whakaronga revenue for social housing. As I understand it, when we sell a rubbish bag, that's used to fund the rubbish services, et cetera. So could I have some, I guess, comment around how ring fencing or tagging of revenue works at a council level?
Yes, you're right. We do have a number of examples of things that we look to say relate to a particular activity. And I guess, in a sense, anything that we've got in the way of a targeted rate or whatever that's used for that particular activity in broad terms. So each activity, for example, if there's a water activity and we're charging for water, then that's applied to the water activity as one of the costs, one of the ways of funding that activity. And so if we've got some general type of revenue that's coming in that we wish to identify, then as I mentioned earlier and you picked up, we've decided about the use of proceeds of sale of a subdivision. Now in that case, it does become a bit of a trade-off as to how we handle it. In years ago in local government, there used to be lots and lots of little buckets of money that we'd have stored for particular things, and you'd invest that money and it would be separately there, identifiable as cash that you had for that purpose. Now we've moved well away from that these days, and we operate an environment where sometimes we keep track of what revenue we might have received from some particular thing, and then if the question's asked, you can say, well, we've spent it on this, or and so there have been examples in the past where we've tried to do things, for example, with parking and parking enforcement, where we're looking to have that to go against debt repayment. So there's a range of different things. I think I might preempt something that I know that you wish to talk about, and that's the case of the revenue from the wind farm. And in that case, we did at a workshop talk about options for how that might be treated. it becomes slightly difficult if we don't know exactly the sum of money that's going to be received, and we don't know exactly how much we're going to spend in a particular year, because it then means in our overall sort of treasury philosophy of having no buckets of money for things that we're storing aside and using for a rainy day or using for a particular purpose, then how do we track what's going on with that? And so in the case of the wind farm, at the moment we're making assumptions about 500,000 in year one, 800,000 per annum beyond that. It could be less than that in year one, it could be more. It could be more than what we've projected in terms of the 800 assumption. And I'm, in the case of the wind farm proceeds, in particular, there is legislation that prescribes the type of use that you can have, that you can apply those funds for, and provided that we meet that, that's part of the test. But philosophically, the council, if it wanted to apply the funds to particular programs, unless they're an operating program, then they won't have a direct impact on rates in the way in which we've applied it for the moment. So if we, and it depends how widely you're going to prescribe what it could be used for, in a sense, as to whether it became practical to apply the funds in a more ring-fenced type of way.
Thanks, Steve. We've just got Kathy wanting to add to that, I think.
Steve mentioned the application of legislation. So where land is held under the Reserves Act, any revenue derived from that reserve must be used and applied to the management, operation, maintenance and investment in reserves. Similar thing with the cemeteries, anything that we collect in cemetery fees must be accounted for and applied to with cemeteries. And that's legislative.
Could I, sorry, just a button, sorry, Councillor. I mean, because this is quite important. Is the resolution reserves or biodiversity? And I know the two are linked, but there's actually there's a bit of a difference there.
So I'm not a legal person, but my interpretation would be that if you were to use the funds derived from reserve for biodiversity, then it would have to be biodiversity on reserves, because as an administering a body under the Reserves Act, we must apply them to other reserves that we administer.
We administer? Okay, so we couldn't use this for Te Apiti?
It's reserves under our administration, if it's derived from a reserve.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Councillor.
No, thank you. Can I just follow up, Kathy, with you, I think, to get your sort of understanding of it then from an operational perspective? Because what I'm hearing you describe is that actually these funds are already ring-fenced. It's just a question of how closely they are ring-fenced.
That is correct in the application of them. Obviously, the amount of money we're talking about here is, a small amount compared to the total money we spend on reserves, and a lot of the biodiversity projects we have are actually on reserves. However, the total amount of biodiversity programs we have is well short of what we are anticipating the revenue would be, and my understanding was it was not councillors' intentions that this money would be seen as a windfall, but as a funding source for things already contained within the LTP.
Thank you. Can I just further clarify then, when you say that your view is that the biodiversity investments that the city currently makes in reserves is well short of the expected revenue, are you including operations of Central Energy Trust Wild Base as a biodiversity activity?
No, I'm only including those projects that council has listed as LTP in the biodiversity section of the plan.
Right, that's helpful clarification. Thank you. The second area of questions that I had is around the KPIs in the transport space, which are on page 520 of the document that you can't search as a PDF. just wanted to know there, they indicate that they're all mandatory measures, and I just wondered who mandates that and what process goes into that, and whether it's the measure of success that's mandated or whether it's the target that's mandated.
I can answer that. So it's mandated by Internal Affairs, and they mandate the measure but not the target necessarily.
Thank you. So when we have a measure that says something like footpaths meet the council standard, I guess how does that speak to that mandate?
I think on that one, the Internal Affairs measure is that the council's, whichever council it is, standards are met. So it's kind of a bit of a circle in there.
Given that in the last long-term plan, we indicated for 3 years that we would be working on an improved way of benchmarking our footpath system quality, have we thought about better ways of communicating it than simply saying it meets the council standard?
I think we might need to describe the council standard better. Is that what you're getting at?
My concern is that I think most people that would read the council standard would relate it to the present state and therefore describe it as unacceptable, whereas as I understand what we've done is some work to develop a standard that's quite a lot higher, and I think it would be appropriate to communicate clearly to the community what we're actually trying to achieve.
I'll just get Robert to answer that, please.
Councillor, we have undertaken surveys and we have scored the footpaths and primarily the faults on the footpath network in a scoring system of 1 to 5. We've determined a target level of footpath faults at 4 and 5, and I think that is captured somewhere, but possibly not explicitly in this particular location. But we are certainly setting a target to keep those within 10%. So 90% of the footpaths essentially meet grades 1 to 3. So there is an explicit measure captured somewhere in our level of service. Maybe it's in the asset management plan rather than at this level. So.
Thanks. I guess from that I would just flag a concern around how we're communicating KPIs. Final question that I have then is just really following up from Councillor Johnson's queries around the list of projects that were considered but not included, but that we explicitly wanted to ask the community's view on. So you indicated that would be provided. Can I just get a sense of when that would be provided and what mechanism there would be for elected members to correct or otherwise address any issues with that?
So there's 2 levels of items that were considered but not included. There's some that you explicitly asked to be mentioned as sort of the proposal option plus proposal, so they are actually specifically identified in the consultation document under each goal, and then the intention is to put a fuller list of items considered but not included on a page where we talk about other consultation. We haven't compiled that yet, but we can compile it shortly and send it out to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I'm down to just a couple of areas of questioning. First, I suppose it's kind of a big picture question for you, David. You'll be aware council comes under some criticism sometimes for work we do in workshops, and I wanted to give an opportunity in this public forum to describe the process that we've been through, the amount of time that's been involved in that, how that relates to us not making decisions behind closed doors, and just to get that in the public forum. So if you wouldn't mind commenting on the process so far.
Yeah, I did touch on that a little bit at the start and talked about our, the journey from, really post the 2019 elections, which you could potentially say is a journey from the post the 2016 elections. But really there has been, there was a check-in at the end of 2019, but then in early 2020 there was a series of workshops around, are we comfortable with the continuation of the vision and goals? And that was relatively, we reached that conclusion relatively quickly. And then during the course of 2020, there were, regular workshops on the strategies, the plans, the levels of service, the asset management plans, and those various strategies and documents that support this. So I guess while a lot of that occurs behind closed doors, I think the consultation process is, as well there is the CD, there is a raft of information that is a continuation of that journey that is available to the public. So, one of the things we didn't have a slide on, which is a little bit conscious of as it's presenting, was the strategies and plans. So they've all been refined. I'd probably the best description for those, and they will go out as information that's available for people to comment on. So, I think the nature of the LTP process means that it is very much behind closed doors for the best part of a calendar year, and then it makes its way into the public domain over, a 2, 3, 4, 5 month period between now and June. So, significant amount of work, but equally there's a significant amount of testing that will occur with the community through the process.
So, workshops are appropriately used to give direction to staff, not to make decisions. How would you describe the direction that elected members gave through that process?
I've had a greater involvement in the second half of the process than the first half, so there's a qualification. But, I talked at the start that this is really a continuation of the journey that this city has been on. I think that a lot of those big catalyst projects are a continuation of catalyst projects that were in the 2018 plan. We knew about Nature Calls in the 2018 plan. We know more about that now. We know more about the significance of that and the costs. We know more about the water reforms. I think there was a question earlier about the key differences between the last LTP and this LTP. I think, the water reforms, the scale of Nature Calls, and the focus on maintenance and renewals has probably been the areas where we've gathered more information and we've been challenged. But if you look across, the Manawatu River, the Esplanade, Te Apiri, the Streetscape Plan, Arena, those catalyst projects, the way we're managing growth, Kautiri, Kakatangiata, Whakaronga, all of that is a continuation of the current journey. And probably the simplest way to describe that is the spatial plan that we developed as part of the last LTP requires very little amendment to be included within the consultation document for this. So, as I said, I think a continuation of the journey is definitely a theme of this LTP.
So if
and that's the direction we felt that his officers received.
If we hadn't had the workshops that we went through beginning of this year, end of last year, is the document in front of us the one that officers would have proposed without that direction from councillors?
Councillor, I'm just a bit unsure where this is all heading. I'm not sure that question's quite appropriate.
I'm just seeking to bring into the public arena the work that councillors have done to give direction to where this document is, because I think we all know what we've done, but if you don't sit in this chamber and aren't privy to those workshops, you might think that this document is solely from officers. And actually, elected members have had a significant input into that direction. From where I sit, and I don't want to move into comment, but just to explain my questioning, from where I sit, we have done significant work to give officers direction that has resulted in a proposal which I'm very happy with. But it wouldn't be correct for the public to think that this was simply officers' work that reflects everything that they wanted to get into this plan, because I know and we know that there's been significant movement over the last few months, and that's what I want to give the officer the opportunity to explain.
I will take that, I think.
Thank you.
You are right, there has been significant amount of work being done on this process, and what happens in the beginning is that we come reflecting the thoughts that have been expressed in the workshops that have taken place. This is a reflection of the direction that councillors have given us. I don't think it's appropriate for us to make comment on whether it's the one that we think should be there or not. That is not our role. Our role is to develop a long-term plan based on the direction that has been set for us by councillors.
Thank you for that. The second, and it's quite a small item that I wanted to pull up, but I wanted to understand, in the consultation document, we have what we're proposing, and then we move into what if we spent or did less. And I wanted to understand where those specific examples came from. So, for example, in Innovative and Growing City, we describe 5 things that we're proposing, but we only suggest that we could not do one of those, and it's the one that involves an external partner organisation. So I wanted to understand what the process was of choosing something we could do less of, or is that simply for illustrative purposes and people shouldn't read too much into it?
I would say it's for illustrative purposes, to try to illustrate the scope of what council could change.
So it could have been any one of those things. You're just saying we could do less in any one of these areas.
That's certainly the intent, is not to ask residents about specific things we could do less of, but say, is there anything you want less of done? And then to point out the implications of that. And the same for doing more of things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just one point I wanted to bring up on the bigger document on page 50, which is around sustainable growth. We talk about 3 areas in there, which talks about Roxburgh Crescent, Huia Street and Albert Street Depot, all talking about using those 3 areas for housing. Have we had a council resolution that we're actually going to be doing that for all of those 3 areas? Because I don't remember that coming through the chamber. I know that Huia Street we have gone out for consultation, but I'm not sure we have done for the other two on page 50.
So Roxburgh Crescent was flagged. We'll go through them one by one. So Roxburgh Crescent was flagged in the last city development strategy, and we've been working with the landowners there to rezone that land. So it's not owned by the council, but it is an example of a historical industrial area. The Huia Street Reserve, we have a council resolution to proceed with changes to the legislation to enable that. And the Albert Street Depot site, there is not an explicit resolution, but like a lot of things in these documents, they reflect the conversations that have been held in workshops. And there has been, recall a distinct conversation. It was about relocation of the Albert Street Depot to investigate that. So, I agree. There is greater certainty on Roxburgh and Huia Street. Albert Street Depot, for instance, we don't have an explicit council direction, so we could potentially look at the wording of that just to make it a little bit more clear. That would be investigating the potential relocation of the Albert Street Depot.
Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you everyone for this report. So following on from Councillor Johnson, when I looked at this, I've been trying to figure out how this compares with previous years. And one of the things I did come across was specifically the page that we got on Monday in this document around the little bubbles that kind of show you where everything is on page 70. So looking at this one, on page 70 and 71, I actually went through and compared that with 2 years ago, this one, from our annual budget discussions then. And so one of my questions is specifically, I think, on the libraries. In our new one, it says that we're spending around $4.07 or 7.51% on libraries. But in the previous one, it says that we're spending $4.68 or 9.33% on libraries. And I just wanted to clarify whether this is just a maths or inflation or some other kind of issue, or if it's actually a reduction in library services or library resources.
I'm not absolutely sure without having to check the figures. Certainly the maths, in terms of the way in which this is worked out, if the library proportionately is if as the rates are going to increase quite significantly and the library were to stay roughly the same, then it would be proportionately slightly less of the whole than what it was before. So from that perspective, I'd expect it to reduce in terms of the way it shows up in this particular graph.
Cool. So, okay, so that does make sense, but I guess my question is, how can we see whether there has been a reduction or not a reduction in comparison to previous years?
Okay. Well, in the financials, near the end of the big document, we've got a page which would show the costs, if I could find them, to do with the library operations, compared with the current year's annual budget, for example. And I can't put my finger on it at the moment as to just which page that might be.
Mr. Mayor, it's page 555.
Page 5.
555 of the supporting
Triple
material.
5, thank you.
Of our agenda.
Yes. So what we're saying in relation to libraries at the moment is that there is a budget that the operating costs of the budget would be marginally less than what we've got in the current year. We're saying 9.77 million of costs compared with 9.83. Now, sometimes those reductions are more about the way in which we allocate some overheads or whatever amongst activities, and it's not necessarily a reflection of on-the-ground reductions in the particular activity per se, but I don't recall the detail of what's resulted in that marginal reduction in terms of what we're saying is the overall cost at the high level of running that service.
So I guess, and with this one, that's also a reduction from last year's annual budget, which we had already kind of trimmed a little bit, didn't we?
Some things, yes, in the budget for this year.
Okay, so I guess for me, that's one thing. The other one that I might like to highlight is with Safe Communities in this one, it looks like we've combined animal control and civil defence from this one. So in this one, it adds up to 82 cents, which is 1.51%. And in this one, it adds up to $1, which is 1.38%. And so I just want to confirm whether that has also been a reduction in levels of service or resources, or if that's, again, one of those mass questions.
559.
I think there's certainly a different combination of those activities now compared with what there was previously, with the restructuring of the way in which we're viewing what the components are. And in terms of which things we drew out on this page to show, I mean, I made that call as to how we were going to break that down in terms of a matter of public interest, I suppose. And I haven't reminded myself, but I would be surprised in terms of animal control, the costs of animal control are rising. So I would be thinking that there's not, I mean, I wouldn't be seeing a reduction in that particular element of it. And civil defence, we're in risk and things, we're committing to greater resources in that area as well. So in terms of how it's translated into this particular figure, I'd need to go and double check how that happened.
So how do our community find these things out without having to go through hundreds of pages worth of financial documents to work out whether there is
a reduction or not?
Reductions or not?
Yeah, well, I think in the case if we were suggesting there was going to be material reductions in the levels of service in a particular area, that's something that would normally be highlighted in the details on the activity pages, if they're material enough. But in this case, my belief is that there's not any signalled change in the level of service of any consequence for these, and therefore these figures are supposed to be, I suppose, just illustrative of roughly the sort of amount of things, because for every ratepayer it's different. It's not going to be the amount. This is just an example of the type of split of this funding if you did it on a proportionate basis. So yeah, it is really hard to find something that's going to drill down and be meaningful to every individual ratepayer, I admit that.
Okay, and then finally I did have a question on page 76 of this big thing. Program 1373 and also program 1959. When I look at those ones, firstly with 1373, it says there that the amount is 2,284,000 for the investigation of a new recycling drop-off facility. Can you confirm that that's actually more than just an investigation? That would be an investigation and a building a thing or something? That's a significant amount of money. Sorry, it's on page 54, I suppose, of your bits, but page 76 of the council's big documents.
It's program
1373.
Okay, you've got me mixed up now.
Yeah, so there's two of them. The first one is 1373. Thank you. And the other one on that same page is 1959, and that's 819,000 for the EnviroHub and Resource Recovery Centre. And I was just wondering, actually, when you're looking at those two figures occurring in those years, is that actually going to be sufficient? Is that an investigation, or is that actually building a thing? Given the cost of house prices at the moment, you know, that's about the same amount of a house. Would that pay for an EnviroHub?
Definitely in respect to the EnviroHub, that was a approximate build cost, although to be fair, there was some we haven't really done any investigation into this yet, so that is, I guess, could be considered a bit of a placeholder. Perhaps a program name change is appropriate rather than just investigation. There will be a portion of investigation that needs to be done, so possibly that can be split out accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, councillors, we will break now. We've got a few more of you on the queue. I'm picking and just looking at the Chair of Arts that we will be going over into this afternoon because we will break at 12 and then 1 o'clock is Arts, and then we'll probably look at coming back to, we'll get through as much as we can, but I can sense that this will carry on for a while. So let's have a break and we'll be back here just after 11. Thank you. Kia ora everybody, welcome back. We will move into things and councillors, we've got more questions and I'll go to Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and now I've got to get myself organised. Right, on page 447, and this is just a clarification, please. The sports house, it was my understanding that we'd removed that through a council motion. So I was just wondering why it's still in the preferred master plan inclusion.
Yes, no, I agree, that should be removed.
Okay, thank you. And the other clarification I'd just like is on page 575, and it's program 1807 to do with the car parks. It's got 800k for car park improvements, and I was just trying to get clarification, is some of that tied up with the urban cycleway improvements, or is this quite an increase what we normally spend on car parks? So I was just trying to get some clarification about what that was. And sorry, I've missed this previously. It was just when I was going through the document that it's on page 575.
My recollection is that it's to do with the investment that was felt to be required in parking management in particular, in order to enable us to address some of the proposals for changes. New on-street technology for car park is the basis of what that 800.
Okay, no, that's fine. I was just hoping we weren't just cross-pollinating with the urban cycleways, but if that's okay, I'll take that as the answer. And one of the, I just wanted the proposal for the grandstand funding that's just been brought forward. I'd just like to ask, or is it possible to suggest that you've got the first year of being 600k, and one of the issues we have with projects of this size previously is that there's no proof of concept phase, which should be the first phase of a project. So could we split the 600k to, say, year 2 being 100k as a proof of concept, and then the 500k drops down to design and consents, because we always seem to miss a process.
Yeah, the feasibility has been done. That work's already been done. You know that exists.
So it hasn't come to council yet?
Feasibility study, I'm unsure if it has. It was some time ago. It was wrapped up in the whole master plan. So it probably has come to council. I don't know the detail.
It was done as part of the master plan. Whether it came to council or not, I'm not sure.
This isn't anything new, councillor. This has been in
No,
there the whole
I
time.
don't have a problem with the project. I'm just having a problem with the process, and I don't want to get us lost like what happened with the arena before, where there's just, it should come back, but there should be especially around the cost, because I mean, we get into issues around costs, and I just think there needs to be a phase which says we tick this off as, and
Can I just add something here? If you wanted that in, councillor, I think you'd require additional funding for that, because that has not been funded in the 600,000 or budgeted in the 600,000, only the design and consent. If you then wanted another feasibility or a proof of concept, you'd have to put some money in there for that.
well, I suppose what I'm trying to stop happening is I don't want us to get into an issue where we have spent $500,000 on a design and then we get told that the project's now not 12 million, it's 24 million. So I want to process...
But councillor, like the Arena Master Plan, we had a set amount of money and we just managed that set amount of money through good project management. As you know yourself, that could have ballooned out.
Oh, I understand that, but it's a little bit different when you've got a plan that we had for the arena with a stand is a little bit different.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a grandstand, so what are you going to do? Just say, oh, we'll just have half a grandstand, or we won't put the piles in because they're going to be...
Yeah. I don't think the numbers have just been plucked out of the air. There has been some design work done on it, probably prior to you coming to the steering group. I mean, I would hate to think we'd go through the process of a feasibility study again, which already exists.
Sorry, but it's not the feasibility. I don't have a problem with the...
Okay.
It's
So is it the QS here after, the
yeah,
costing?
Yeah, that's what I want. So I just want to get...
I would suggest, if that was the case, that we just increase that to $700,000 from 600. I think because we have done majority of the concept planning already, it would be essentially a double checking exercise. So I think we could probably do both in that 1 year and progressing to a consented design if that was the case. So essentially increasing the overall program by $100,000.
And that would just put a step in to validate. That's all I'm asking for.
I would have thought that would have been done anyway, to be fair.
Well, if there's no budget in there to do it, then obviously it isn't in there.
All right, any further questions?
So can I get confirmation that will be done through the...
Well, it's a recommendation. We'll need to agree to it.
Okay, so I'll put it through as a recommendation later then? Okay. Yep, okay, that's fine. I'll leave that.
All right, Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just wanted to understand that I thought it was quite surprising seeing the consultation document at 81 pages, and I just want to understand what has been circulated to the residential base. Because I understand, since found out in the break that this is not getting circulated to the households, but can I understand what will be, if anything?
I'll just get the officers to reply to that.
Kia koutou, through you, Mr. Mayor. We're currently working on the materials that will go out to households and to all the other stakeholder groups and meetings that we're planning. As you can imagine, the planning for this consultation has been quite difficult, given that we don't yet have definite dates for the audit. But the proposal is at this stage that small summary, as in very, very small summary, would go to households, all of it pointing to the online submission process, as well as the other ways that people can submit.
Will that document come through to the council meeting for our approval? Do we get to see that?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. I mean, it will obviously be based on the documentation that is agreed by council when you approve it for consultation. If we've got that work done, then yes, and yeah, that can be approved at that stage. But I guess it's the collateral that goes along with any consultation process. There could be a whole lot of stuff. There could be radio advertisements, other materials. We wouldn't normally expect those to be approved through the chamber.
The cut-down consultation document, if I recall last time, was signed off by the Mayor and myself, so we have normal processes for that type of sign-off. Okay, well, my recollection would have me thinking that we would have had a sign-off from council for public documents. But I'm happy with the response. I understand that there's limited opportunity for us to sign off something before it goes out to consultation. Thank you.
If I could just add, there's going to be a variety of materials. For example, some material we're hoping to do through civics education in schools. So there are a number of things that are going to be going on with this consultation process. The household distribution is just one of those things.
So, sorry, before you jump back into you, councillor. So Julie, are we pushing more of this to, and more of we're directing people to the full gambit of material online? Is that what we're doing?
Yes, so a variety of things. So for example, we're going to be trying to get to as many interest group and, say, stakeholder coordinated groups, for example. So the Community Services Council, for instance, will no doubt help us host a meeting of their constituent groups. We would obviously take the most relevant material, so strategy and plans, to those groups and talk about those in a lot of detail, but we'd also be telling them about how to access all the rest of the material, how to find out about individual programs, how to have their say as citizens in all the varieties of ways. But there will always be, hopefully, an online an online submission process is the priority. We'd hope that people do that, but we're very aware that some people prefer to write in their handwriting and some people prefer to fill out a form, and so we'll enable all those. You can also ring the call centre and have it recorded if you want to.
Yeah, and for those that aren't that au fait with the online process, that we'll still have service centres, libraries, those sorts of things with all
That's
the
right.
material?
Yep, as usual, yep.
Okay.
Add something there. Just to add, Mr Mayor, the way we will communicate this is through a schedule of activities and collateral, and we can provide that through the CEO's EM update, so you're aware of exactly what's going out when and how people can access information, if that would be suitable.
I think that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Just, I've got several inquiries. One is the significance of doubling the DCs, or the development contributions, for residential properties. I've looked through the consultation document, and the only reference I can see of it is on page 63 of the order paper, which is a little slither of a pie graph at 2%. How is somebody meant to be drawn to something so significant like doubling the development contributions? Can I understand, please?
So what we typically do with the development contributions policy alongside the LTP is typically quite a small component of the community that are really interested in that in terms of the development community. So what we do alongside the LTP is an explicit consultation process with the development community. So we've got a development database, and we actually provide them a full copy of the development contributions with a letter and an opportunity to talk and meet, things like that. So that's historically what's been done. I anticipate that would happen again. So it tends to be a more direct engagement with the development community.
Okay, thank you. In the slides, it highlighted a point that the catch surplus from the Whakaronga subdivision, which also is around terminology, I've noticed that it still mentions Whakaronga. Maybe it should be Tamakuku Terrace, but that's a minor edit. But the cash surplus has been redirected to social housing renewals. Is that a formal decision, or is that something that came out of a workshop? I can't recall that direction.
That did come out of direction from a workshop and is embraced, and that's why I've referred to it as one of the assumptions that we've got here today, just so that that's in the public domain, really, is that's an assumption that we're making.
Okay. And just lastly, with the financial forecast and the policy, with the proposal, which needs to be formalised, I get that, around the grandstand at the arena, being 12 million being brought forward to year 3, 4 and 5, is there a suggestion that we'd need to find 12 million to push back out to year 7, 8, 9? Otherwise, I understand we're going to be peaking out in the middle of our 10-year plan. The impact of that?
I think I haven't added these things in those years to see exactly what difference it would make to the various things, but my feeling is that it won't be that significant in the big scheme of things in terms of moving it forward. There's a reasonable sum of money there, but relative to the rest of the capital program, it's not material.
2/3 of it's external too.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, maybe I just clarify one thing, because I understand there might be recommendations coming later. that on page 35 of the consultation document, which is, it says around the property, under program 902, the seismic strengthening of council properties, and it lists several, and it has a financial figure there, but that is not related, or is it, to the civic and cultural precinct master plan? That's just addressing the seismic work, is that correct? Yep.
That is correct.
Okay. So if we were to advance that operational program in year one of 250, there's no actual financial envelope to do any of the work that might be decided thereafter that? So, okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thank you. Back to you, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a few further questions. Firstly, Mr. Mayor, are you wanting questions related to the consultation document as part of, are we doing everything together now?
Yes, if you've, questions of the officers while we've got them.
Yeah,
Because
for everything.
Yep, everything that's we're going to discuss around the all the other documents as well as the consultation document.
So just in terms of the, I guess the wording that's been included in the commentary in the consultation document, I guess is based on some of the key messaging, and one of the assumptions around that we talked about earlier was the comment that had been made multiple times in the documents that without the nature calls, our borrowing would be sustainable, and that we've identified nature calls as being the reason for it not being sustainable as opposed to any of the other borrowing. That comes into, that comment is on the preface from the Chief Executive and Mayor, and also comes in multiple times. I guess given that the officers have acknowledged that it's the full capital expenditure that's causing the fact that the document is unsustainable, I'm just wondering if that's a fair comment to make, or whether that sort of misrepresents the true situation of what is actually causing the plan to be unsustainable. And if we want to change that, what would be the mechanism for that? I guess it would be, I'm assuming it's about key messaging, to change that to be referring to the full capital spend rather than one item in it, but I'm just trying to get an understanding of how we would change that messaging so that it reflects more accurately the actual situation.
Well, first of all, as I'm one of the authors of it, I don't agree with your assumption on that, and the officers have answered your questions, but I'll let the CE or the officers speak to that.
Mayor and Councillor Naylor, I think perhaps I can first address a question that Councillor Naylor asked earlier. Well, in fact, there were two questions. One was about the level of debt and what amount of debt would need to be, what reduction in the total debt requirement would need to be in order to live within the limits. And we haven't done that calculation with any precision, but just a very off the back of the envelope type calculation is that we'd need to reduce it by somewhere around about $500 million, 500 million, to live within the council's present limits. Now that means that though we could still live within the LGFA limits a bit beyond that. I think at an earlier workshop I had a graph that I presented to you which had taken the figures that we had at that time and took all the water stuff out and said with all of the water stuff out, or should I say the water and the wastewater activity stuff removed in its totality, not just the wastewater project, then we could perhaps live just within that framework of those things. So it was more than just the Nature Calls project, it was all of the stuff to do with water and wastewater that needed to come out in order for us to live within those limits. So that, I guess, is one thing. And just whilst I'm at it, you asked another question, perhaps I can answer two at the same time. Well, no, we'll cover that. No, I'll cover that later.
With regard to the preface that is there, that is a statement by myself and the Mayor. We've both signed that off and we're very happy with how it stands at the moment. If Council are not agreeing with that, I would suggest that they would require an amendment through this committee.
Okay, just to follow up on that, and thank you, Steve, that's really helpful to find that out. If it is indeed $500 million or $500 million that would be required to be taken out for the plan to be sustainable, I guess I'm asking the Chief Executive and the Mayor if they think that the statement, without nature calls, our borrowing would be sustainable, is even an accurate statement to have in that preface.
Yes, because I think you've just got the answer from the officer that it's all of Waters as well.
Well, the statement just refers to nature calls.
You've got my answer, Councillor.
Okay, I'll move on. The page 66 of the consultation document, with the graph, with the change of the rates increase affordability maximum policy levels and the suggested change to our policy, and the green line indicates what's proposed as the new limit, and I understand what's caused that to be higher in those first 2 years as opposed to the policy limit that was in our current LTP, which is the red line, or pink, or whatever colour it is. What I don't understand is what's causing the green line to go up in the later years, because I would have thought if we were keeping the policy limit consistent, other than that additional for renewal, which only is impacted in the first 2 years, that green line would be quite similar to the red line from post year 3. I don't quite understand that.
I'm just double checking the calculation that I had to arrive. For example, you're wondering why it's 7.5 up in that third last year. As it happens in that, the way we've got our renewal scheduled at that particular time between the 27-28 and 28-29 year, as it stands at the moment, there's a 1.4% increase in effective, the renewals increase from the average renewals increase from 1 year to the next is the equivalent of 1.4% increase in the rates from 1 year to the next.
Okay, thank you.
And that's the thing that's a bit higher than it is in other years, just the way the renewals are scheduled.
Thank you. Just the next question was related to workshops, and I appreciate the questions that Councillor Bowen has already asked around that, just to bring light to the process that has preceded today. I guess what I would like to follow that up with would be just to get some acknowledgement. Officers are talking about the direction from Council that was received in workshops and how that's informed the document that we've got in front of us today. I'm just wondering if it could be clarified how the decisions were made about what would be included and not included in terms of the programs.
So in terms of the ranking exercise we went through in terms of the programs, I mean, depends how far back we want to go. We've got the vision and goals, we've got the strategies, we've got the plans, and then we've got the levels of service, and then the programs that drop out of that.
Programs.
So there was some criteria. We ranked programs from put into 3 categories, and we provided some criteria. The staff went through and assessed those programs against criteria, but we then went through line by line as a collective group to make a decision about whether a program was in or out or amended. So that was a collective decision of council.
And so that decision-making process looked like what? To decide whether it was in and out? Like a vote taken in terms of raising of the hand, or? It
was a session chaired by the Mayor.
You were part of it, Councillor.
I'm aware of that. I mean, I can talk about it, but I'm just think that there is some value, as Councillor Bowen has mentioned, in this is the decision-making process
So they were
now
put
to
in priorities, and it was around health and safety, legislative, and obviously that those reached the top of the pile, and those that were the nice-to-haves fell off.
Okay, so just a couple more questions and then I'm done. Thanks for that. The Streets for People program in the document, is that all capital new program? Or is there any renewals that contribute towards that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is 100% new.
Okay, thank you. I had thought that was the case. I'm just wondering if any of those areas that are outlined in the programs for Streets for People are due for any renewals within the next 10 years.
As part of the process of doing the design, we will be identifying areas that will be needing renewal and look at those budgets, whether or not we can use those. But at this stage, I can't give you a confirmation, but as we go through the design process, we'll be identifying things that need to be upgraded.
So I guess where my questioning is coming from is that we had a paper come a couple of years ago to identify that capital new programs, if there were infrastructure that was up for renewal, that would be funded partially by renewal budgets and partially by capital new budgets. And I'm just wondering if those policies or principles will be applied to, well, they don't appear to be applied at the moment in the current draft budgets, and I'm just wondering why that is or whether there's any intention to change that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, on each of the projects we work through, we do look at whether or not there is the opportunity to replace asset at the same time as we're doing capital new. So that has not changed in our approach. So we have not changed any approach regarding using leverages from renewals, if it's appropriate.
So I'm not quite understanding, as it stands, all the funding that's allocated to Streets for People is capital new, but it's been acknowledged that there might be some renewals that come up as a part of that, and I'm just wondering why that's not included as a part of the funding for those programs in the plan, as we see it now.
To answer your question, I'm sorry, we haven't identified what those opportunities are. We're working through the design process at the moment, and when we get further down the process, we'll be able to identify what are the assets that require renewal funding. But
So are you suggesting that the funding will then change partway in to be some from renewals and some from capital new as per the policy? And when would that change in the budgets?
I guess what I'm saying is that when we work through the design process, we'll be identifying assets that may require renewal. For example, the pipe work within the road space. And then we'll be looking at using the renewal funding to do that whilst we are doing the capital new work. Predominantly the capital new work is funded for what we see on the street itself at the moment. And a lot of that work will be changing the existing curb lines. It may be, which we not be able to use renewal work funding for. So it's a kind of an iterative process as we work through the design.
Okay, thank you. I think that's helpful. Just the final question relates to our audit process and decision-making going forward. David, you clarified during the presentation that we would be able to make changes to the consultation document post-audit, but not the financial components, I suppose, if I understood you correctly. If the audit process identifies issues or concerns with the finances, what is the process for us to make changes to that so that in order to remedy that for the purposes of achieving the audit?
So once we hear from audit, there will then be a conversation with the council before the plan then comes back as a final draft. So we don't want to preempt the audit process, but we need to engage in that, await their advice or their feedback or their decision, and then make any changes accordingly. So I think the key thing is once we sign off the draft of the draft today, we can't make any what I'd call substantive changes to the overall plan. However, I think there is the scope to kind of, maybe refine design or, the types of things we've talked about today, add in a sentence around refugee settlement, those sorts of things. But we wouldn't want to be seeing any substantive, particularly financial changes or the way those are described after today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, officers. And we'll now get into, on page 13 of your documents, of your phone book, we have the committee recommendations. What I'm going to do, councillors, because there's a number of amendments, we will break up number 2 line by line. It's the only way to do this. We'll get through the first couple and then it'll free up and hopefully we'll be away. So we'll start from the top, and we've got approving the 2021 10-year plan supporting material, including the draft financial and infrastructure strategies and updated funding and updated funding and financial policies and draft consultation document for the audit. Number 1 is the committee recommends that the proposed revenue and financing policy and the proposed 2021 development contributions policy be approved for public consultation. So I'm going to take this one by one. I'll look to move that first one, seconded by the Deputy Mayor, and I'll open it up for any comments. And there being none, we will look to vote on this first one. Thank you. That's passed 13 votes, 4, none against. Thank you. Right, number 2. Number 2A. And this is around the committee recommends the supporting material consisting of the following documents be approved, subject to audit on the basis for the consultation document for the 2021 10-year plan. A, Council's 2021 vision, principles and goals, plus council strategies be approved. So I'll look to move those. A second to thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll open it up for any comments. There is. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm largely comfortable with the goals, the vision, principles and goals as outlined, but would like to make one proposed amendment to Goal 3 to read a connected, inclusive and safe community. The reason for that is that the word inclusive has been requested by the Disability Reference Group to be included in this goal, and I believe that will strengthen the goal for a number of reasons. I think whilst it is in the detail underneath that goal and the strategies, the concept of inclusiveness, it's certainly the disability group reference group felt that elevating that strengthened that goal in terms of the approach that we take as a council to our community, and I endorse that. I acknowledge that this was discussed in a workshop setting and wasn't accepted, and I communicated that to the Disability Reference Group recently at a meeting, and they asked me, why didn't the council approve that or accept that? I felt like I was in a very difficult position because I wasn't in a position to be able to convey other elected members' views that had been discussed in a workshop to them as the reasons why, and actually I couldn't remember what those reasons were anyway. So I felt it was appropriate to bring this into a public forum for a public discussion or debate or decision on this change. And so I'd urge you to support it. And if not, I'm sure elected members know that they are able to say why if they wish. But thank you.
Right, I'll open it up for any comments of this amendment. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thanks. Just to briefly speak as seconder of this, I'm up for goals that have 3 adjectives in them. And to me, inclusive is a very important aspect across so many dimensions in our community, not simply the disability community, although acknowledging that it is extremely important there. But when you think about any aspect of our community, I think you would find that an inclusive approach is valued, and so I'm quite comfortable with it surfacing at this level.
Can I just ask the staff, so we would then delete it out of the strategy wording? It would end up being on both, would it? If this was successful.
My eyesight is not good enough to read it from back there, but my understanding is this is about adding it to the title. It's already included in the text.
It is? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll open it up for further comments. So the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to oppose this. We have included inclusive in the strategy and elevating it after hearing from the Disability Reference Group around this request. I feel that if we are going to start relitigating every aspect of this plan, of our long-term plan that we've pulled together in here, it's not going to make for a day of cohesive decision-making. I do have real concerns with this. If we start to include small aspects such as just extending the goals by including one word, why are we not stopping and actually taking stock of what we're trying to achieve with this goal and ensuring that that's not already covered? For example, we have got welcoming communities accreditation. So how about we consider changing this to a connected, inclusive, welcoming and safe community? We are working through the age-friendly accreditation, so perhaps we could also include a connected, inclusive, welcoming and safe community for people of all ages, and so on and so on. What we are trying to achieve with our goals includes inclusivity. It is very clearly included in our strategy and plans. We have already elevated it. We have been through an exercise. The goals were one of the very first things that we reviewed back at the Chalet last year. And we've been through this exercise where we've looked at our goals one by one. I appreciate that this is a forum where we are signing this off, but we have already addressed this multiple times. So I'm not supporting this today. I won't be supporting any amendments to the goals or the name of the goals at this stage. And if we hear from our community a real drive to change our goals, that we've missed the mark on something, I'll consider it at that stage.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just to give notice that if this passes, I'll be proposing an amendment to include welcoming in the title as well.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Deputy Mayor's mentioned it. I'm just making it super specific. Page 13 of the consultation document highlights our principles of the city, and it says inclusive in bold. It's the very first bullet point there across the page as one of our guiding principles across all our activities that council pursues, and so therefore I see very little benefit in adding it to one of the goals. Thank you.
Okay, we have no further comments, but I'll just go back to the mover of this amendment for a right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just make a few comments briefly on our process, I guess, which isn't specifically just related to this amendment, but relates to some further amendments that I intend to bring to the table today. The comment was made by the Deputy Mayor that this has been addressed multiple times. Under the local government legislation, this is the place where council makes decisions, and I believe that the community deserve the ability to hear the discussion and decisions that are made by this council in a transparent way. That is the reason that I have chosen a few items to bring to this table today, even though a number of them have already been discussed in a workshop setting. Whilst I acknowledge the value of workshops, I am also a little bit uneasy about the level of decision-making that I see is slipping into workshops that I believe should happen in this forum to really align with local government legislation's intent. So I'll just say that now and perhaps won't repeat it for every item, but I think it's...
Point of order, Mr Mayor. A right of reply is to address the points that have already been raised. It's not to introduce new information as per standing orders.
The point...
Actually, can we just stick to what you're talking about?
Yep, I'd just like to address the point of order as well, which was the information that was brought into this discussion by the Deputy Mayor was that this has been addressed multiple times, and that's the issue that I'm just commenting on briefly now. So in terms of this amendment, as I said, I think it strengthens it and I support it, so I'd urge you to support it also. Thank you.
All right, councillors, we have the amendment there. I'll ask you to vote, please. That has failed. 5 votes for and 8 against. Are there any other amendments? I haven't received any other amendments for this category, so we will go back to the substantive of A, Council's 2021 vision, principles, goals, plus Council strategies be adopted. So I'm not going to speak to this, we will just vote, please. And it's passed 13 votes for, none against. We now move to what I believe will be B, which is Council's plans. So 2021 to 24. And I will be looking to move those. I'm a seconder. Deputy Mayor, thank you. Are there any comments to this? There being none, we will put this to the vote, please. Oh, Councillor Naylor, you've just dropped in.
Sorry, just a quick question of clarity. The amendments to change programs, I'm assuming that wouldn't be under this item? Would that be under the activity levels?
It'll come under, we'll do the next one, which is activity levels of service and budgets. Yeah.
Thank you.
Has passed 13 votes for and none against. Councillors, the next one, which is activity levels of service and budgets, I've got 13 or 14 amendments to that. I may go to the financial strategy, the next one, which is D, and we'll go with that. We'll go through to that. We do have an amendment there. I'm just looking at our time. So while staff are getting that up, which is D around the financial, adopting the financial strategy, there is an amendment from Councillor Naylor. I'll get you to speak to it, that the rates increase policy limit be LGCI plus growth plus 2%. Would you like to speak to that, please?
Thank you. This policy limit, whilst did get some discussion in workshops, there wasn't any decision or resolution to that discussion other than a few suggestions made. So what has been proposed in terms of the inclusion of the asset renewal component and increasing the other component to 2 to 3%, I don't support those suggested changes, and what I'm proposing is that it remain as it was originally, as LGCI plus growth plus 2%. Obviously, we also had the additional debt repayment, which I don't think needs to be included in that. My reason being, it's meant to be an affordability policy maximum, and I think if it's not meaningful, it's not even any point having it, although I do understand legislation requires us to have something. So I think if we're going to have something, it does need to be meaningful. My view is that the red line on that graph, which would be what I'm suggesting, is a more reasonable and appropriate policy limit. And we're breaking, whichever option we take, we're exceeding the limit anyway. So I think the important thing in my view is that if we are exceeding it, that we communicate well to our community the reasons why we're exceeding it. But in terms of finding an appropriate policy limit, I think this one is more appropriate.
All right, councillors, open up. I've got Councillor Johnson here. I'm not sure if that was for this one.
It's just a quick question, really, Mr. Mayor. I've got some general comments about the whole 10-year plan. When is the most appropriate time to make those?
We'll do that in the next one, activity, because
Okay.
that's when I'm going to make some general comments
All right,
as well.
okay, thank you.
All right, so this one, I'll open this one up. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be supporting the proposed amendment. I'm actually quite comfortable with the proposal that came through from the workshops. Councillor Naylor's, of course, correct that there should be a plan to live within our strategies, but our strategy has to describe what we're doing, what's it worth on the ground. For me, and I talked about this in workshop, I have to be able to explain why that's the limit we're setting. And if the limit we're setting is completely unworkable, then what is the point of that? So over the years, we have changed our financial strategy. Last time round to include that particular focus on debt repayment. This time, I'm particularly pleased to see that focus on our infrastructure renewals. I think as the officer said in his comments, 2% is not a magic number. It's just the number that he's been working with. And we could pick any other number for that, as long as we can communicate that to our community. And on that basis, I'm very happy with what's proposed.
Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to know if we could get a comment from Steve on this recommendation.
He's already commented, but in reference to...
If we go with
If we go with this, would there be issues? Is that
Yep.
what you're saying?
Yep.
Okay. I'll allow that, Jess.
Yes. I'm uncertain what the best way is, to be honest. I've made a suggestion to you as to a change. As was commented, we don't live within it for some of that time, and the reason that we don't, we can explain, and is mostly in relation to the investment that's required in the wastewater at that time. So I think it's personally, it's better to have something that you're more likely to be complying with than not. So to have something that's at the level of the red line, I see that's really misrepresenting where we really think we're saying we're going, and it needs to be saying something more than that And what I've given is not necessarily the exact, the right answer, but it's an answer that I think is more explainable than the red line.
Is that fine? Good. Okay. Councillor Dennison.
Yep, thank you, Mr Mayor. I have some sympathy for the recommendation because actually these are just kind of suggestions just to kind of make something work, and they arbitrary in so many ways. And I had an appeal to it when it was suggested at the workshop, but when I've seen the effect of it, and it's only affecting year 1 and 2, actually, with that renewal, asset renewal, I see that a little bit manipulating the actual policy. And so therefore, I was happy with the 3%. I can stick with 2%. I think, but I'm going to support the recommendation on the basis that the rationale for change is still questionable. Thank you.
All right, there's no more comments. I'll go back, give you a right of reply, Councillor Naylor.
I'm happy with what I've said.
Okay. I'll now ask you to vote on the amendment there, that the rates increase policy be changed to limit to LGCI plus growth plus 2%. And that has failed. 4 votes for and 9 against. So we'll go back to the D before we break. And that is to approve the financial strategy. I'll look to move that. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. I don't really wish to speak to it. I think it's been well circulated and discussed. I'll ask you to vote, please. We've passed speaking, sorry. So it's 12 votes for and 1 against. Councillors will now adjourn the meeting till the end of the Arts, Culture and Heritage meeting, and we'll now adjourn for lunch. That's your meeting, councillors, due to start at 1?
Yes, starting at 1 p.m. in here. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll swap seats and everything and then come back in here at 1. Thank you.